Senator Adam Schiff strutted into the Senate chamber, expecting an effortless victory lap, completely blind to the terrifying reality that Senator John Kennedy was waiting to publicly, methodically, and permanently obliterate his entire political empire. You don't wear a ski mask when you rob the American people, Adam. You wear a custom Italian suit. You stare right into a television camera, and you call it protecting democracy. The words didn't just echo in the Senate chamber, they hit the marble walls like a kinetic strike. Have you ever watched a hunter realize, in real time, that it is actually the prey? That is exactly what the American public witnessed on a blistering Tuesday morning in May of 2026. The greatest trick the Washington cartel ever pulled wasn't convincing you that they were honest. It was convincing you that their absolute corruption was actually the law. We have been told for years, day in and day out, by the corporate press, that the system is functioning normally. They look into the camera lenses and tell us the alphabet agencies are nonpartisan. They tell us the sudden, synchronized censorship of conservative voices is just routine content moderation. They tell us that bankrupting and indicting their political opponents is merely the objective rule of law. But you know the truth, and they are terrified that you know it. You know we are living under a censorship industrial complex. It is a hybrid alliance of big tech oligarchs, intelligence operatives, and Washington bureaucrats who have weaponized the justice system to crush dissent. They are the people who shut down your businesses, censored your opinions, and called you a domestic threat for having the audacity to attend a local school board meeting. They do not hide it in smoke-filled back rooms anymore. They do it in broad daylight. They do it right to your face, daring you to complain, so they can label you a threat to the Republic. And the absolute epicenter of that arrogance, the high priest of the Washington swamp, was sitting at the center of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Adam Schiff. Freshly minted as the newly elected senator from the collapsing state of California, he looked less like a public servant and more like a corporate liquidator waiting to sell off the final remains of the American middle class. The air in the hearing room was thick, practically vibrating with the collective anticipation of the legacy media. The press gallery was a sea of expensive laptops, perfectly styled hair, and absolute conformity. They weren't there to report the news or ask hard questions. They were there to act as the Praetorian Guard for the establishment. Their chyrons were already written, sitting in the production trucks, ready to be flashed across airport televisions from coast to coast. Senator Schiff dismantles, MAGA conspiracy theorist. California senator defends rule of law against Southern extremism. Schiff was flanked by a phalanx of 5 high-priced attorneys from K Street. They looked like a pack of wolves in silk ties. Their glowing tablets were synced, their files were encrypted, and their strategy was completely locked down. They were the ultimate insiders, the highly paid mechanics of the deep state. They were about to publicly dismantle the reputation of a man who dared to question their absolute authority. And then, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the chamber swung open. Senator John Kennedy walked in. He didn't have a team of crisis managers trailing behind him. He didn't have an iPad or a teleprompter. He didn't even have a staffer to carry his coat. He walked down the center aisle completely alone. In his right hand, he carried a scarred, sun-faded, battered leather briefcase. It looked like it had been dragged through a Louisiana swamp, survived Hurricane Katrina, and had not seen a drop of leather polish since the Reagan administration. A collective, audible scoff rippled through the press box. One of Schiff's lawyers leaned over and whispered something behind his hand. Schiff let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, making sure the hot microphone picked up the sound. They looked at the white-haired man from Baton Rouge and saw a relic of a bygone era. They saw a slow-talking, backwards Southerner who had no business being in the same room with the architects of the modern global order. They thought they were dealing with a caricature. They had no idea they were looking at their ultimate challenger. The chairman struck the heavy wooden gavel. The red lights on the cameras flipped on, broadcasting live to millions of households desperately looking for accountability. Schiff didn't wait a single second. He went straight for the attack. He leaned into his microphone, his voice dripping with that manufactured, coastal elite condescension we have all come to utterly despise. Senator Kennedy, I realize the highly classified nature of federal intelligence protocols might be a bit overwhelming for you, Schiff began. We are dealing with the architecture of global security today, not a zoning dispute in the Louisiana Bayou. He strongly suggested Kennedy sit back, listen to the experts, and try not to slow down the adults in the room with his trademark folksy anecdotes. The American people do not have the time or the patience for your backwoods obstructionism today. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. It was a calculated, brutal public humiliation, designed for primetime television. The reporters in the front row practically salivated, their fingers hovering rapidly over their keyboards. Schiff leaned back in his plush leather chair, a smug, impenetrable smirk plastered across his face. He had drawn first strike. He had asserted dominance. Kennedy didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice in defensive anger. He didn't try to defend his honor or demand an apology. He slowly reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a completely unraveled cloth, and began cleaning his reading glasses. He took a painfully long time, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. The silence stopped being a victory lap for the establishment and started becoming extremely uncomfortable. Kennedy finally placed his glasses on the bridge of his nose. He looked right through the 5 lawyers. He looked right through the flashing cameras. He locked his eyes directly onto Adam Schiff. You know, Adam, where I come from? We have a saying about men who brag about how smart they are before the test even starts, Kennedy drawled. We say they are usually the ones who stole the answer key. But what is truly pathetic is that you stole the answer key, and you still managed to fail the exam. Schiff's smirk vanished instantly. His lead attorney sat bolt upright, the smugness draining from his face. You called me a backwoods obstructionist, Kennedy continued, his voice dropping an octave, losing every single ounce of its usual grandfatherly warmth. You told the American people to trust the experts. You told them to trust you. Kennedy placed his hands on the heavy brass latches of the scarred leather briefcase. Well, I didn't bring anecdotes for the American people today. I brought an autopsy of every single lie you have peddled, packaged, and sold to this country for the last 10 years. The twin brass latches of the briefcase snapped open. The metallic sound cracked through the dead-silent Senate chamber like a judge's gavel striking a heavy stone. Class is in session, Senator, and I'm about to expel you. The metallic click of those brass latches echoing in the Senate chamber should have been a warning siren to anyone with an ounce of self-awareness. That sound was the definitive end of the political theater and the beginning of a legal reckoning. But Adam Schiff did not hear a warning. He could not hear it. When you spend your entire career inside the reinforced, soundproof bubble of the Washington establishment, you lose the ability to hear anything other than your own applause. Schiff looked at the worn leather briefcase resting on the polished mahogany desk and saw nothing but a pathetic prop. He saw a desperate, last-ditch stunt from a man he fundamentally viewed as an intellectual inferior. This is the fatal flaw of the radical left and the administrative state. They do not just disagree with you. They do not just think your policies are wrong. They genuinely, deep down in their bones, believe that you are stupid. They believe that if you do not live in a coastal zip code, if you do not have a preferred pronoun listed in your bio, and if you speak with a regional accent, you are a lower form of life. Schiff adjusted his posture, leaning forward into the microphone with the predatory confidence of a man who believes he holds all the cards. He did not know what was in those folders, and frankly, he did not care. He had the media, He had the intelligence apparatus. He had the backing of the Silicon Valley billionaires. To him, John Kennedy was not a United States senator. Kennedy was a caricature, a walking, talking stereotype that Schiff was about to use as a punching bag for the evening news cycle. "A briefcase full of paper, Senator?" Schiff asked, his voice adopting that mock sympathetic tone usually reserved for scolding a toddler. "Is this the part where you pull out some printed-out blog posts and internet conspiracies?" Schiff chuckled, a dry, rehearsed sound that signaled the press gallery to join in. A few compliant reporters in the front row dutifully offered soft laughter. "Let us be absolutely clear about what is happening here today, John," Schiff continued, dropping the formal title to assert his perceived dominance. "You are out of your depth. You are sitting in a room where we discuss the highest echelons of national security, global intelligence networks, and the delicate architecture of the Federal Republic. This is not a county fair in Louisiana. This is not a place for your folksy charm and your carefully rehearsed Southern colloquialisms." Schiff's voice began to rise, taking on the righteous indignation that had made him the darling of the late-night comedy shows. He was not speaking to Kennedy anymore. He was speaking directly to the cameras. He was delivering his audition tape to the elite donor class, proving that he was the ultimate bulwark against the populist uprising. "The American people are exhausted by this performance," Schiff declared, pointing a manicured finger across the room. "They are tired of watching an ignorant Southern puppet try to dismantle the very institutions that keep this country safe." There it was. The mask slipped, and the absolute contempt poured out. An ignorant Southern puppet. He did not just insult Kennedy's intelligence, he insulted his geography, his culture, and, by extension, the tens of millions of Americans who voted for the America First agenda. Schiff was operating on a very specific, highly calculated objective. He needed to frame Kennedy and the entire MAGA movement as fundamentally incapable of understanding the complexities of the modern world. If the public believes that the populist right is just a collection of ignorant, backward-thinking rubes, then the public will accept that the deep state must exist to protect the country from them. Schiff's entire argument rested on the premise that you are too uneducated to govern yourselves. Therefore, you need him. You need his secret hearings. You need his censored internet. You need his weaponized Department of Justice. You do not understand the intelligence you are given, and you lack the sophistication to grasp the geopolitical consequences of your obstruction," Schiff sneered. "You are a mouthpiece for a dangerous, regressive fringe that refuses to accept the expertise of the people who actually run this government." Schiff crossed his arms, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. Completely satisfied with his own monologue, he had delivered the perfect soundbite. He could already see the CNN chyrons flashing at the bottom of the screen. He expected Kennedy to snap back. He expected the Louisiana senator to get red in the face, to bang his fist on the table, to yell into the microphone in a defensive rage. That is what politicians do when they are cornered. They lash out. They create chaos. And chaos is exactly what Schiff wanted, because chaos would allow the media to brand Kennedy as unhinged and emotionally unstable. But Kennedy did not bang his fist. He did not yell. He did not flush with anger. In fact, he did not say a single word. The silence that followed Schiff's aggressive tirade was profound. It was the kind of heavy, atmospheric silence that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. In the high-stakes world of political theater, dead air is supposed to be a sign of weakness. If you aren't talking, you are losing. But Kennedy flipped that rule entirely on its head. He let the silence stretch out, second after agonizing second. He let Adam Schiff's arrogant, elitist insult hang in the sterile air of the Senate chamber like a bad smell. Kennedy slowly reached up and removed his reading glasses. He held them up to the fluorescent lights, inspecting the lenses with the casual indifference of a man sitting on his front porch on a Sunday afternoon. He reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out a perfectly folded, slightly frayed cotton handkerchief. He began to clean the lenses. He rubbed the glass in slow, methodical circles. The reporters in the gallery stopped typing. The frantic clacking of laptop keys faded away, until the only sound in the room was the soft hum of the air conditioning unit. Schiff's 5 Wall Street lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were trained to handle objections, to file motions, to argue the law. They were not trained to handle absolute, unbothered silence. Psychologically, what Kennedy was doing was devastating. By refusing to react, he was denying Schiff the validation of a fight. He was treating the newly elected senator from California not as a formidable opponent, but as an annoying, buzzing mosquito that wasn't even worth swatting. Yet, Schiff's confident smirk began to stiffen. The adrenaline from his aggressive monologue was wearing off, leaving him exposed in the quiet room. He shifted his weight. He cleared his throat. He looked at the chairman of the committee as if expecting someone to intervene and force Kennedy to speak. But Kennedy was not on anyone else's schedule. He was operating on Louisiana time. He blew a speck of dust off his left lens. He held the glasses back up to the light. He gave them one final wipe with the handkerchief. This is the difference between a man who projects fake authority and a man who possesses genuine power. Schiff needed the cameras, the teleprompters, and the media echo chamber to make himself feel important. Kennedy just needed the truth. And when you have the truth sitting right in front of you in 23 manila folders, you do not need to rush. You do not need to raise your voice. Kennedy was letting Schiff dig his own grave. Schiff had just gone on national television and confidently declared that the man sitting across from him was an ignorant, uneducated puppet who couldn't comprehend complex documents. He had drawn a massive, glaring target on his own forehead. He had set the stakes. He had explicitly framed the impending confrontation as a battle between his own supreme intellect and Kennedy's supposed Southern ignorance. It was the ultimate trap of liberal hubris. Schiff believed his own press clippings. He actually believed the narrative that his media allies had spun for him. He forgot the cardinal rule of any courtroom, a rule that any first-year law student knows by heart. Never underestimate your opposing counsel, and never, ever ask a question or make an accusation unless you already know exactly what the answer is going to be. Kennedy carefully folded the cotton handkerchief. He placed it back into his breast pocket with deliberate precision. He slid his glasses back onto his face, adjusting the wire frames behind his ears. He rested his forearms on the desk, his hands resting lightly on the first folder inside the battered leather briefcase. He looked at Adam Schiff. The smirk was completely gone from the California senator's face now, replaced by a tight, rigid mask of forced composure. Schiff was beginning to realize, perhaps for the first time in his pampered, insulated political career, that the script he had written for this hearing was no longer being followed. The media in the back of the room leaned forward collectively. The camera zoomed in tight on Kennedy's face. The trap had been meticulously set by Schiff's own monumental arrogance. All Kennedy had to do now was spring it. Let me tell you something fundamental about the modern ruling class. They suffer from a terminal, incurable case of credentialism. They honestly believe that a piece of expensive parchment from an Ivy League university grants them a divine, unquestionable right to manage every single aspect of your life. They think it makes them morally superior to the working-class people who actually keep this country running. Adam Schiff built his entire political identity, his entire bloated ego, on that exact elitist premise. He looked down his perfectly contoured nose at John Kennedy, because Kennedy did not speak with the rapid, neurotic, focus-grouped cadence of a Washington insider. Schiff mistook a deliberate Southern drawl for a slow mind. He mistook politeness for weakness, and that is the greatest, most fatal miscalculation the radical left makes every single day in this country. They think you are stupid." They thought John Kennedy was stupid. Kennedy leaned closer to the microphone, his posture completely relaxed, his shoulders completely at ease. He did not raise his voice a single decibel. He didn't have to. "Senator Schiff, I listened very closely to your opening remarks," Kennedy began, his voice smooth and steady. "You seem profoundly concerned about my ability to comprehend the complex, sophisticated architecture of your federal intelligence protocols. You sat there on national television, and you called me an ignorant Southern puppet. You heavily implied that my education, or my supposed lack thereof, makes me entirely unfit to review your life's work." A pin dropping in that Senate chamber would have sounded like a massive shockwave. The reporters in the gallery were holding their breath, waiting for the trademark MAGA outrage they could clip and spin for the evening news. They wanted Kennedy to lose his temper, so they could label him unhinged. But Kennedy was completely, utterly in control. "Now, my mama always taught me that it is terribly impolite to brag," Kennedy continued, a faint, razor-sharp smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "She used to say that a man who constantly has to tell you how smart he is usually isn't, but since you have explicitly decided to make my academic pedigree a matter of official congressional record today, I suppose we should clear the air, just so the American people don't go to bed tonight thinking they elected a complete fool to represent them." Kennedy adjusted his posture, looking directly into the bank of television cameras. "I did manage to somehow muddle my way through Vanderbilt University. I know it is not the elite coastal institution you and your friends prefer, but we actually managed to read a few books down there, and then, by some stroke of pure, unadulterated Southern luck, I stumbled into the University of Virginia School of Law. I even managed to graduate with honors right there on Mr. Jefferson's beautiful campus." Kennedy paused, letting the weight of those institutions settle over the room. But he wasn't finished. "I suppose the real aberration, the real glitch in the system, was when I crossed the pond. You see, Adam, I somehow tricked the selection committee into making me a Rhodes Scholar. I spent a few years over at Oxford University, Magdalen College to be precise, studying law, political philosophy, and the fundamental rights of free men. The physical reaction in the room was instantaneous and absolute. You could practically hear the oxygen being violently sucked out of the press gallery. The CNN anchors in the front row suddenly stopped typing. The 5 high-priced Wall Street lawyers sitting behind Schiff suddenly looked like they had just swallowed broken glass. Their entire multi-million-dollar legal strategy was built on bullying a backwoods caricature. They had prepared to verbally abuse a farmer. They had not prepared to cross-examine a top-tier legal scholar who had navigated the halls of Oxford while they were still trying to figure out how to pass the LSAT. Schiff's jaw tightened so hard you could see the muscles twitching through his skin. The color violently drained from his face, leaving him with a pale, sickly, panicked complexion. He had walked right into a completely avoidable, humiliating trap of his own making. He had tried to intellectually shame a man who possessed a resume that dwarfed his own. Kennedy didn't even pause to gloat. He didn't need to. The total destruction of Schiff's premise was self-evident. Kennedy reached his large, weathered hands into the battered leather briefcase. He bypassed the thick stacks of financial records, the surveillance logs, and the bank statements. He pulled out the very first folder. It was a simple, unassuming manila file. It did not have a classified red stamp on it. It did not have a top-secret government seal. Kennedy opened it and withdrew a bound stack of paper that looked noticeably old, the edges slightly yellowed by time. "Now, Adam, since we have officially established that I can in fact read, I decided to do a little bit of homework on you," Kennedy said. "I didn't consult the New York Times. I didn't ask MSNBC for their highly curated, safely fact-checked corporate opinion of your illustrious career. I went straight to the source. I went to the very document that launched your entire legal worldview. Kennedy held the bound document up high, ensuring every single camera lens in the room could catch the title. This is your thesis from Harvard Law School, the very institution that handed you the credentials you use to look down on the rest of this country. The title is absolutely fascinating. It is called Prosecutorial Ethics and the Pursuit of Truth in the Modern Justice System. You wrote this when you were young, hungry, and apparently still fully capable of recognizing what the truth actually looks like. A low murmur rolled through the gallery. Schiff gripped the edges of his polished mahogany desk, his knuckles turning completely white. I found page 47 to be particularly enlightening, Kennedy continued. Let me read your own words back to you, Senator, just to make sure my slow Southern brain is properly comprehending your high-minded Ivy League prose. Kennedy looked down at the highlighted page. Quote, "The ultimate duty of a prosecutor is not to secure a conviction at any cost. It is to serve as an impartial guardian of the truth. A prosecutor who fabricates evidence or who deliberately obscures exculpatory facts to fit a predetermined political narrative does not just violate the rights of the accused, he corrupts the very foundation of the republic and renders the justice system indistinguishable from a tyranny." Kennedy slowly closed the document. The sound of the heavy paper snapping shut echoed through the sensitive microphones like a physical blow. "Your words, Adam, not mine," Kennedy declared. "You wrote that the deliberate obscuring of facts to fit a political narrative is the absolute hallmark of tyranny. You literally wrote the manual on how a corrupt prosecutor destroys a free republic, and then you moved to Washington and spent the last 10 years using that exact manual as your personal political playbook." Kennedy leaned forward, bracing his forearms on the desk. The grandfatherly, folksy persona was entirely gone now. He wasn't the slow-talking Southerner anymore, he was the Rhodes Scholar. He was the brilliant, meticulous legal mind who had just surgically dismantled the moral authority of the Democratic Party's most arrogant golden boy. "You thought you could come in here today and dazzle us with your bespoke suit and your rehearsed focus group talking points," Kennedy stated. "You thought you could intimidate the truth into absolute silence just by insulting the man delivering it. Well, I have some terrible news for you, Senator. The American people are sick and tired of being lectured by hypocrites who break the laws they swear to protect." Kennedy reached out and firmly tapped the top of the 22 remaining folders still sitting inside his leather briefcase. "You wanted to test my education? You wanted a master class in federal oversight? Well, I suggest you grab a pen and a notebook, Adam, because class is officially in session, and today, the tuition is absolutely free." "Do you remember where you were when they first told you the President of the United States was a foreign asset?" Kennedy asked. "Think back to those early days. They blanketed the airwaves with it. It was not just a news story. It was a completely manufactured, federally subsidized industry. And the CEO of that industry, the chief architect of the greatest political illusion in modern American history, was sitting right there at the mahogany desk. Adam Schiff did not just participate in the Russia hoax, he directed it, he choreographed it. He used it to build his entire national profile, hopping from one cable news green room to another, soaking up the adoration of a compliant press corps. Kennedy looked down at the open manila folder resting on his desk. He did not look angry, he looked profoundly disappointed, which, if you know anything about Southern gentlemen, is infinitely more dangerous than anger. "Senator Schiff, let us take a little stroll down memory lane," Kennedy drawled, his voice carrying effortlessly across the dead-silent chamber. "Let us talk about your legacy, because long before you were trying to manage our elections from the Senate, you were running the House Intelligence Committee. And you spent years looking right into the camera, telling the American people that you had direct empirical evidence of betrayal. Schiff let out a heavy, exaggerated sigh, rolling his eyes dramatically for the benefit of the press box. "Are we really doing this, John?" Schiff interrupted, his voice laced with that trademark manufactured boredom. "Are we really going to rehash debunked Republican talking points from almost a decade ago? The American people have moved on. They want us focusing on the future, not nursing your partisan grievances." Kennedy did not even blink. "Oh, I am strictly focused on the future, Adam. Because a man who builds his house on a foundation of lies cannot be trusted to build the future of this republic." Kennedy pulled a single crisp sheet of paper from the folder. "You see, I had my staff do a little bit of arithmetic. We went back and watched every single Sunday morning talk show. We pulled the transcripts from CNN, MSNBC, and the late-night comedy circuit. We counted. Between 2017 and 2020, you went on national television and explicitly stated that you had more than circumstantial evidence of Russian collusion." Kennedy leaned closer to the microphone, his eyes locked onto Schiff like a laser. "You said it exactly 237 times. 237 separate occasions where you looked the American taxpayer in the eye and sold them a complete fabricated fiction." Schiff scoffed, waving his hand dismissively in the air. "I was operating on the intelligence assessments available to my committee at the time, Senator. We had a constitutional duty to investigate credible threats to our democratic process. If you have a problem with the intelligence community's findings, take it up with them." Schiff smiled his smug, insulated smile. It was his classic, time-tested defense mechanism: hide behind the alphabet agencies, hide behind the classification protocols. He thought he was safe because the inner workings of the House Intelligence Committee were sealed in a federal vault. He thought the SCIF, the Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, was his personal, impenetrable fortress. But Kennedy just shook his head, offering a gesture of profound, withering pity. "You see, Adam, that is the fundamental problem with building a fortress out of classified documents. Eventually, somebody changes the locks." Kennedy reached back into the open folder. He did not pull out another piece of paper. He pulled out a small black digital audio player. He placed it deliberately on the desk, right next to the microphone. The 5 high-priced Wall Street lawyers sitting behind Schiff suddenly stopped breathing. You could actually see the smugness evaporate from Schiff's face, replaced instantly by a tight, terrifying realization. "Now, as you know, Senator, last month in April of 2026, a new wave of declassification orders came down from the executive branch," Kennedy explained. "A lot of things that were previously buried in the dark suddenly saw the unforgiving light of day, including the raw, unedited audio recordings of the closed-door sessions of your committee." Schiff's lead attorney lunged forward, grabbing Schiff's shoulder and whispering frantically into his ear. "Mr. Chairman," Schiff stammered, his voice suddenly pitching up an octave, the polished veneer cracking completely. "Mr. Chairman, the release of those specific committee recordings is currently the subject of ongoing litigation. This is highly irregular and potentially violates Senate rules on sensitive compartmented information." Kennedy did not wait for the chairman to rule. "It is fully declassified, Adam. I have the unredacted authorization right here. Signed, sealed, and delivered. You cannot hide behind the classification stamp anymore." Kennedy reached out and pressed the play button. The audio quality was slightly grainy, typical of a secure room recording, but the voice echoing through the chamber was unmistakable. It was Adam Schiff, but it was not the confident, booming, self-righteous voice he used on television. It was quiet. It was calculating. It was the voice of a political operative managing a crisis. "Look, I understand what the Inspector General is saying. Schiff's recorded voice stated clearly from the small speaker. I have read the raw intercepts. We have nothing. There is zero empirical evidence of a back channel, and the primary subsource is completely compromised. Another voice on the tape, presumably an investigator or senior staffer, responded, So, how do we present this to the press tomorrow morning? There was a heavy, static-filled pause on the recording. Then Schiff's voice returned, cold, pragmatic, and entirely devoid of ethics. We don't. We say the investigation is highly sensitive and ongoing. We say we have seen deeply concerning evidence that we cannot share due to sources and methods. The media will do the rest of the heavy lifting for us. They want this to be true just as badly as we do. Kennedy reached out and pressed the stop button. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the terrifying silence of a collapsing political empire. The legacy reporters sitting in the gallery, the very people Schiff had mocked on that tape as willing, useful accomplices, sat frozen in their seats. They had just heard, in his own unvarnished words, exactly how they had been played for absolute fools. Kennedy picked up his notes, his drawl cutting through the tension like a straight razor. That recording, Senator Schiff, was made at 4:15 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. Do you know what you did the very next morning? Kennedy did not wait for an answer. At 7:30 a.m. on Wednesday, exactly 15 hours after you admitted in a secure room that you had absolutely nothing, you went live on a national morning broadcast. I have the transcript right here. The anchor asked you if there was direct evidence of collusion, and you looked right into the camera and said, yes. There is significant, more than circumstantial evidence in plain sight. Kennedy took off his glasses. He stared across the room at the man sitting opposite him. You didn't just lie, Adam. You engineered a massive, coordinated fraud against the United States of America. You knew the Steele dossier was absolute garbage. You knew the FISA warrants were obtained through intentional deception. You knew the primary subsource was a suspected foreign agent. You knew all of it. And yet you walked out of that skiff every single day and poured gasoline on a deeply divided nation. You tore this country apart at the seams. You pitted neighbor against neighbor, family against family. You paralyzed a duly elected administration for years. You cost the American taxpayers tens of millions of dollars in useless, theatrical investigations. And why? Because you thought the rules did not apply to you. Because you thought your personal political agenda was infinitely more important than the truth. Schiff looked like he was going to be physically ill. His hands were trembling visibly on the polished mahogany desk. He couldn't look at Kennedy. He couldn't look at the cameras. He couldn't even look at his own lawyers, who were now frantically scrolling through their tablets, realizing that their client had just committed political ruin on live television. Schiff stared straight down at his perfectly manicured hands, the color completely drained from his face. You accused half the country of being traitors, Kennedy continued, his voice echoing with righteous, slow-burning fury. You branded innocent Americans as agents of a foreign power just because they voted differently than your coastal elite donors. But the only man in this room who actively, consciously conspired to deceive the American people is sitting in your chair. Kennedy closed the first folder, 237 lies caught on tape. And that, Senator Schiff, is just the first folder. There is a specific kind of stench that emanates from the intersection of high-level politics and low-level morality. It is the smell of a rotting conscience hidden behind a $1,000 silk tie. If you thought the Russia hoax was a betrayal of the country, wait until you see the betrayal of the human soul. We are told by the radical left and by their stenographers in the media that they are the party of compassion. They tell us they are the champions of the marginalized, the protectors of the vulnerable, and the moral arbiters of our culture. They look down from their ivory towers in West Hollywood and Washington, lecturing you about your privilege, while they sip vintage wine bought with the funds of the desperate. It is May of 2026, and the air in this Senate chamber just turned ice cold. Senator John Kennedy isn't looking at a laptop or a teleprompter. He is looking at folder number 7. Adam Schiff is trying to maintain his composure, but the sweat is starting to bead on his upper lip, visible even through the high-definition cameras. His legal team is whispering so loudly it sounds like a nest of disturbed vipers. They know what is in this folder. They have spent years trying to bury it under a mountain of procedural delays and media blackouts. But the deep state can only hide the truth for so long before the weight of it collapses the ceiling. Kennedy leans forward, his voice dropping into a register that feels like a tolling bell. Senator Schiff, let us move away from the abstract world of geopolitics and talk about something much more intimate. Let us talk about your friends in California. We judge a man by the company he keeps, because a man who lies down with dogs shouldn't be surprised when he wakes up with fleas. But in your case, Adam, the dogs weren't just barking. They were dangerous. Kennedy reaches into the battered leather briefcase and pulls out a stack of photographs. He doesn't show them to the cameras, yet he just lays them face down on the mahogany desk, one by one. Do you recognize the name Ed Buck? Senator, the silence that follows that name is heavy enough to crush a man's rib cage. The corporate reporters in the press box suddenly look like they want to be anywhere else on Earth. They know the name. They helped suppress it for years because the implications were too devastating for the narrative. For those of you listening at home who haven't heard this story, Ed Buck was a high-level Democratic mega-donor. He was a fixture in the California political machine. He was a man who hosted the elite, the powerful, and the virtuous in his West Hollywood apartment. And while he was cutting checks to the Democratic Party, he was also subjecting young, vulnerable individuals to highly illicit chemical substances that led to fatal consequences. He was entertained by their suffering, by their near-fatal experiences, and eventually by their tragic and untimely passing. Kennedy picks up the first folder labeled Moral Bankruptcy. According to the Federal Election Commission records, which I have right here, Ed Buck didn't just donate to your party, Adam. He was one of your most prolific personal supporters. He channeled over $500,000 into your campaigns and your political action committees over the years. $500,000. That is a lot of moral conscience you bought with that money. Schiff's lead attorney stands up, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rehearsed outrage. Mr. Chairman, this is an outrageous smear tactic that has nothing to do with federal intelligence oversight. These donations were legal at the time, and any insinuation of impropriety is a gross violation of Senate decorum. Kennedy doesn't even look at the lawyer. He keeps his eyes locked on Schiff, who is now staring at a spot on the wall behind Kennedy's head. Decorum is a funny word to use when we are talking about fatal casualties hidden within a major donor's private residence. Counselor, Kennedy drawls. Sit down. The lawyer slowly sinks back into his chair, realizing that the old rules of engagement have been revoked. You see, Senator Schiff, the real tragedy isn't just that you took the money. It's that you kept taking it after the first tragic loss was carried out of that apartment in 2017, Kennedy says. You kept taking it after Gemmill Moore tragically lost his life. You kept taking it after Timothy Dean suffered the exact same tragic fate. The entire Democratic establishment in California knew exactly what was happening in that apartment. The community was screaming for justice, but the checks kept clearing. So the politicians stayed silent. Kennedy reaches for a remote on his desk and points it at the large monitors mounted on the chamber walls. I want to show you something that the networks refused to air during your various impeachment circuses. The screen flickers to life. It is a video of a middle-aged woman her face etched with a level of grief that no politician could ever understand. Her name is Letitia Nixon. She is the mother of Gemmill Moore. Her voice is a ragged whisper as she looks directly into the lens. My son is gone because people like Adam Schiff cared more about campaign donations than black lives, she says in the video. They knew Ed Buck was dangerous. They knew he was destroying our sons' lives. But they took his money. They went to his parties. And they protected him while he preyed on us. Adam Schiff didn't just ignore us. He helped cover it up so the money wouldn't stop flowing. The video cuts to black. The hearing room is so quiet you can hear the hum of the electronic equipment. It is the sound of a total moral vacuum. Kennedy takes off his glasses and rubs the bridge of his nose, looking genuinely weary. Senator Schiff, you spent years lecturing the American people about human rights and social justice. You stood on the floor of the House and wept for the cameras about the soul of the nation. But when the soul of your own district was being harvested by a donor, you didn't say a word. You didn't return a single red cent of that $500,000, not after Gemmill, not after Timothy, not even after the FBI finally broke down the door and found the evidence of Buck's depravity. Schiff finally finds his voice, though it sounds thin and brittle like old parchment. I have always supported the investigation into Mr. Buck once the facts became clear, Schiff stammers, and those donations were either returned or donated to charity once the full scope of his crimes was revealed. Kennedy smiles, but there is no warmth in it. It is the smile of someone who just saw the opponent walk into the teeth of the trap. Now, Adam, that is a very interesting claim, because I had my staff verify that with the FEC and the charitable organizations you mentioned. Kennedy pulls a single brightly colored spreadsheet from the folder. According to these official filings, you haven't returned a dime. Not 1 cent. The money is still sitting in your accounts, or it was spent to buy the very airtime you used to lie to the public. You are sitting on a pile of dirty money lecturing us about ethics. In Louisiana, we have a name for people who protect monsters for profit. We call them accomplices. Schiff's hands are shaking so violently now that he has to tuck them under the desk. His eyes are darting toward the exits, looking for a way out of the light. But there is no exit today. The cameras are rolling, the folders are open, and the deep state protection detail has gone silent. You see, folks, this is the reality of the people who want to run your lives, Kennedy states. They talk about equity while they protect bad actors. They talk about truth while they bury unspeakable scandals. They are morally bankrupt, and they think their Ivy League degrees are a bankruptcy protection plan. But John Kennedy just tore up that plan. The room remains silent, the weight of the moral collapse finally sinking in even for the jaded reporters in the back. Kennedy closes the folder with a sharp, final snap. Folder number 7 is done, Adam, and the stench here is becoming unbearable. But don't get too comfortable, because we are just getting to the part where you sold out the rest of the country for a different kind of currency. We are moving to folder number 15, and this one has a very distinct imperial flavor. Let me ask you a very simple question about the city of Washington, D.C., Kennedy says. Have you ever noticed how people go into public service with a modest bank account, and a decade later they are buying multi-million-dollar estates in Martha's Vineyard and Malibu? We are constantly lectured by the corporate media that these politicians are making great personal sacrifices to serve the American people. They tell us that these elites are taking a pay cut to do the hard work of democracy. But the math never quite adds up, does it? You and I both know that you cannot become a multimillionaire on a standard congressional salary of $174,000 a year. It is mathematically impossible, unless, of course, you are selling something that doesn't actually belong to you, unless you are selling out the United States of America. We are back inside the Senate Judiciary Committee room, and the air has turned completely toxic for the establishment. Senator Adam Schiff is sitting at his mahogany desk, looking like a man who has just been hit by a freight train, but hasn't fully realized his legs are missing. The exposure of his ties to Ed Buck and folder number 7 has left his legal team in a state of absolute, paralyzed panic. But Senator John Kennedy is not finished. He is not even close to being finished. Kennedy does not give Schiff a moment to breathe, a moment to spin, or a moment to call for a recess. He reaches his weathered hand right back into that battered leather briefcase. He pulls out folder number 15. This folder is noticeably thicker than the others. Kennedy sets it on the desk and places his hand flat on top of it, looking across the room with eyes that have turned as hard as Louisiana flint. Senator Schiff, we have talked about how you lied to the American people to build your own domestic power, Kennedy says, his drawl cutting through the stifling silence. We have talked about how you protected bad actors to fill your campaign coffers. But those were domestic crimes. Those were betrayals of your own neighbors. Now we need to talk about your international portfolio. Schiff swallows hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously above his expensive silk tie. We need to talk about the Chinese Communist Party, Kennedy states plainly. A collective, audible gasp ripples through the press gallery. The corporate media has spent years aggressively burying any story that connects the democratic establishment to Beijing. They called it a conspiracy theory. They called it xenophobia. But Kennedy is about to show the entire world exactly how the swamp monetizes American decline. You see, Adam, for a man who spent 4 years screaming that his political opponents were compromised by Russia, you have been remarkably quiet about China. Kennedy notes, you have killed every single piece of legislation in your committees that would have held Beijing accountable for intellectual property theft. You voted against tariffs that would have protected American steelworkers. You actively lobbied against restricting Chinese state-owned tech companies from accessing our national security infrastructure. Schiff immediately leans into his microphone, his voice dripping with rehearsed bureaucratic indignation. Senator Kennedy, my voting record is a matter of public policy based on nuanced macroeconomic diplomacy. We live in a globalized world. Antagonizing our largest trading partner with reckless populist sanctions is dangerous and irresponsible. Kennedy smiles. It is a terrifying smile. Nuanced macroeconomic diplomacy, Kennedy repeats slowly, savoring the absolute absurdity of the phrase. That is a very fancy way of saying, you sold the American working class down the river. Kennedy opens folder number 15. He doesn't pull out a document right away. Instead, he leans perfectly still, locks eyes with Adam Schiff, and completely changes the tone, the rhythm, and the language of the hearing. Without breaking eye contact, Kennedy speaks a flawless, rapid-fire sentence in perfect Mandarin Chinese. We, men's Adam. The translation, we know where your money in Macau is, Adam. For exactly 1.5 seconds, pure human instinct overrides years of careful political conditioning. Schiff's eyes widen in absolute, unfiltered terror. He flinches. Leaning back in his chair, his mouth opens, and he stammers, that account was Schiff freezes, his voice catching in his throat as his brain finally catches up with his mouth. He realizes what he just did. He realizes what Kennedy just proved. The Senate chamber erupts into absolute, unmanageable chaos. The CNN and MSNBC reporters in the front row drop their pens. A Republican senator at the far end of the dais actually stands up out of his chair. Kennedy just sits there, completely unbothered, letting the trap snap shut with bone-crushing finality. Well now, Kennedy drawls, switching effortlessly back to his thick Southern accent. Isn't that absolutely fascinating? I just spoke to you in Mandarin, Senator, and you didn't look confused. You didn't ask for a translator. You started to answer me. Where exactly did a congressman from Burbank, California, learn to instinctively understand the dialect of the Chinese intelligence services? Schiff's lead attorney is pulling desperately on Schiff's sleeve, literally trying to physically pull him away from the microphone. Schiff's face has gone from pale to a deep, sickly shade of crimson. I picked up a few phrases during diplomatic trips, Schiff stammers desperately. You are playing parlor tricks, Senator. Kennedy chuckles, a dark, humorless sound. A parlor trick is pulling a rabbit out of a hat, Adam. What I just did was pull a traitor out of a tailored suit. Kennedy reaches into the folder and pulls out a massive, intimidating stack of financial wire transfers. Let us talk about your nuanced diplomacy. Let us talk about your wife's very successful consulting firm, because my investigators found a rather miraculous coincidence in your family's accounting. Kennedy holds up the first sheet of paper. The 14th of March, 2022, you cast the deciding committee vote to block a ban on Chinese telecommunications equipment on American military bases. March 16th, exactly 48 hours later, your wife's consulting firm receives a wire transfer for $75,000 from a holding company registered in Shanghai. Kennedy places the paper down and picks up another. The 8th of November, 2023. You successfully lobbied to kill a human rights sanctions bill targeting the Chinese Communist Party. November 12th. Your family trust receives an anonymous deposit of $120,000 through a shell corporation in Macau. Kennedy begins dropping the wire transfers onto his desk, one by one. The sound like a metronome of absolute corruption. Vote, deposit, vote, deposit. Every single time you betrayed the interests of the United States, your family got richer. You aren't a senator, Adam. You are a foreign asset. You are the most valuable player of the Chinese Communist Party. You are the MVP of Beijing. Schiff is hyperventilating now. He looks to the committee chairman for help, but the chairman is staring down at his own desk, refusing to make eye contact. The Democratic establishment is realizing in real time that Schiff is too toxic to save. This is fabricated evidence, Schiff shouts, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeal. This is Russian disinformation designed to smear me. Bank records. Adam? Kennedy replies calmly. Subpoenaed, authenticated SWIFT banking records. And the ultimate proof isn't just in the individual transfers. The ultimate proof is the grand total. Kennedy pulls a single heavy piece of cardstock from the back of the folder. It is a bar graph, printed in stark black and white. Let us talk about your personal financial disclosures, required by law for all members of Congress. In 2015, before you became the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, your total net worth was approximately $500,000. You were comfortable, but you were not wealthy. Today, in May of 2026, after a decade of public service, your officially reported net worth is $4.5 million. Kennedy lets that number hang in the air. $4.5 million. That is an 800% increase in your personal wealth. During that same time period, inflation crushed the American middle class. Factories in the Rust Belt shut down and moved to Shenzhen. American families couldn't afford groceries or gasoline. The people you were elected to protect got poorer, sicker, and weaker. But you, Adam, you got inexplicably rich. Kennedy leans into the microphone, his eyes burning with the righteous fury of an entire nation that has been sold out. You didn't earn that money. You didn't build a business. You didn't invent a product. And you certainly didn't save any money on a government salary. You sold access. You sold influence. You sold American security to the highest foreign bidder. You are a corruption capitalist, trading the future of our children for a slightly bigger beachfront property in California. The hearing room is entirely devoid of movement. The 5 high-priced lawyers sitting behind Schiff have stopped whispering. They have stopped typing. They are simply staring at the floor, calculating the professional cost of sitting too close to a man who is about to be indicted for treason. Folder number 15 is closed, Senator Kennedy says quietly, but the damage you have done to this republic will take generations to fix. We are not going to let you hide behind the system anymore because the system is broken, and you are the one who broke it. There is a fundamental truth about Washington, D.C. that the corporate media will never, ever tell you. They want you to believe that the establishment is a brotherhood. They want you to think it is an impenetrable fortress built on deep ideological loyalty, but that is a complete lie. There is no loyalty in the swamp. There are only alliances of convenience, held together by the very fragile glue of shared complicity and billable hours. And when the ship finally hits the iceberg, the rats do not stay and play the violin. They scramble for the lifeboats, and they will step on your neck to get a seat. We are at the absolute apex of the hearing. The atmosphere in the Senate Judiciary Committee room has shifted from uncomfortable to practically apocalyptic. Folder number 15 has been opened, the SWIFT banking records, the shell companies in Macau, the undeniable proof of foreign influence. It is all sitting right there, bathed in the harsh glare of the television lights. Senator Adam Schiff is staring at those documents like a man looking at his own obituary. But if you want to understand how power really works in this country, do not look at Schiff, look at the man sitting directly over his right shoulder. Look at his lead attorney. This is a man who charges $2,000 an hour. He is a K Street apex predator. A man who has made a very comfortable living defending the indefensible. He has defended corrupt CEOs, disgraced politicians, and insider traders. He knows how to handle a bad news cycle. He knows how to bury a scandal in procedural motions and jurisdictional disputes. But he also knows the difference between a political scandal and a federal espionage indictment. You can spin a bad vote. You can spin an inappropriate campaign donation. You cannot spin authenticated, synchronized bank transfers from the Chinese Communist Party. The lawyer is looking at the bar graph John Kennedy just presented. He is looking at the 800% increase in Adam Schiff's net worth. He is doing the math in his head, not just on Schiff's finances, but on his own survival, because an attorney cannot suborn perjury. An attorney cannot knowingly present a false defense without risking disbarment, or worse, becoming an unindicted co-conspirator in a racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization's case. The camera catches the exact moment the lawyer makes his calculation. It is a subtle shift, a sudden tightening of the jaw, a cold, dead look in the eyes. He reaches forward and begins to silently gather his papers. He stacks his legal pads. He closes his expensive leather portfolio. Schiff is still hyperventilating, still trying to stammer out a defense about macroeconomic diplomacy, completely oblivious to what is happening right behind him. But Kennedy sees it. Kennedy stops talking and just watches. The silence spreads from the witness table to the press gallery until every single eye in the room is fixed on Schiff's lead counsel. The lawyer stands up. He straightens his tailored suit jacket. He presses the button on his own microphone. "Mr. Chairman," the lawyer says, his voice cold, flat, and completely devoid of emotion. The chairman of the committee looks down, his face a mask of absolute shock. "Yes, Counselor?" the chairman asks. "I need to state for the official record that as of this exact moment, I and my firm can no longer represent Senator Schiff in this or any other matter." The words drop into the room like an anvil. Schiff spins around in his chair so fast he nearly knocks over his glass of water. "What are you doing?" Schiff hisses, his voice cracking, caught on the hot mic. "Sit down." The lawyer does not even look at his now former client. He looks directly at the chairman, and then respectfully at Senator John Kennedy. Pursuant to the rules of professional conduct, specifically regarding irreconcilable ethical conflicts and the sudden presentation of evidence of which counsel was previously unaware, I must immediately withdraw. I advise the senator to seek new independent legal representation. The lawyer reaches down, picks up his briefcase, turns on his heel, and walks out. He does not run. He does not look back. He walks with the brisk, purposeful stride of a man fleeing a burning building. He walks straight down the center aisle, the heavy mahogany doors opening and closing behind him. The 4 junior lawyers remaining at the table look at each other in absolute, wide-eyed terror. Without a word, 2 of them immediately begin packing their bags. They do not even bother to make a statement to the microphone. They simply stand up and follow their boss out the door, abandoning Adam Schiff on live national television. This is what the collapse of the deep state actually looks like. It does not happen with a dramatic shootout. It happens with the quiet, cowardly rustle of briefcases being packed by men trying to save their own skins. Schiff is now sitting at the table completely and utterly isolated. The phalanx of protection is gone. The media cannot save him. His party cannot save him. He turns back to face the dais, his face pale, his eyes wide and panicked. He looks like a man who has just realized he stepped on a landmine, and he is just waiting for the click. Senator John Kennedy does not gloat. He does not smile. He leans forward, resting his elbows on the desk, peering over his reading glasses. "Well now," Kennedy drawls softly, "it seems your defense team has suddenly remembered they have a sudden, pressing engagement somewhere else. Maybe they remembered a dentist appointment. Or maybe, just maybe, they realized that defending a man who sold out his country to Beijing is bad for business." Schiff's mouth is opening and closing, but no sound is coming out. He is completely paralyzed. "Senator Schiff," Kennedy continues, his voice hardening, taking on the tone of a federal prosecutor delivering the final blow, "I have presented you with folder number 7, detailing your protection of a bad actor in exchange for campaign cash. I have presented you with folder number 15, detailing illicit foreign wire transfers directly tied to your voting record. I have laid out the absolute, undeniable proof of your corruption, your greed, and your betrayal of the United States." Kennedy points a long, steady finger directly at Adam Schiff. "I am going to ask you one final question, and I want to remind you that you are sitting under oath. Lying to this committee is a federal felony, punishable by up to 5 years in a federal penitentiary, and your lawyers aren't here to object to the phrasing anymore. The tension in the room is so thick you could cut it with a chainsaw. The reporters in the gallery are not even typing, they are holding their breath." "Senator Schiff," Kennedy asks, his voice booming through the chamber, "did you or did you not knowingly accept financial compensation from foreign entities in exchange for altering American legislative policy? Did you sell out the American people? It is the ultimate trap. It is a perfectly constructed, inescapable corner. If Schiff says yes, he confesses to treason, bribery, and corruption on live television. If Schiff says no, he commits perjury, because the bank records sitting on the desk absolutely prove that he did. Kennedy has given him a choice between total ruin and absolute disgrace." Schiff sits frozen. The seconds tick by. 1, 2, 3. The silence is agonizing. It is the sound of a legacy dying. It is the sound of an arrogant, untouchable elitist, finally facing the terrifying reality of consequences. Schiff looks down at his hands. He looks at the empty chairs where his $1 million legal team used to sit. He looks up at the cameras, the red lights glowing, broadcasting his absolute humiliation to millions of Americans. This is the man who spent years demanding transparency. This is the man who said that if you are innocent, you have nothing to hide. This is the man who demanded the total destruction of his political enemies based on anonymous rumors. Schiff leans forward. His voice is barely a whisper. It is broken, defeated, and utterly pathetic. On the advice of, on my own assessment of the current proceedings. Schiff closes his eyes, unable to look at Kennedy or the cameras. I respectfully invoke my rights under the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution, and I decline to answer the question on the grounds that it may incriminate me. The gasp that erupts from the press gallery is completely audible. The flashbulbs from the photographers go off in a blinding, chaotic frenzy. He did it. Adam Schiff, the golden boy of the Washington establishment, just pleaded the Fifth Amendment. He just invoked his right against self-incrimination regarding charges of bribery and foreign collusion. Kennedy sits back in his chair. He looks at Schiff with an expression of absolute, unvarnished disgust. The Fifth Amendment, Kennedy repeats slowly, letting the words echo, the refuge of the guilty. You have the right to remain silent, Adam. It is a beautiful constitutional right designed to protect citizens from a tyrannical government. But you are the government, and in the court of law, the Fifth Amendment protects you from prison. But in the court of public opinion, in the eyes of the American people, watching you cower behind the Constitution, you spent your entire career trying to shred. Pleading the Fifth isn't a defense, Senator. It is a confession. Kennedy begins to gather the folders, stacking them neatly inside the scarred leather briefcase. You have nothing left to say, Adam. And frankly, the American people are absolutely sick of hearing your voice anyway. The swamp just ran out of places to hide. There is a specific kind of silence that follows the collapse of an empire. It is not a peaceful silence, it is the breathless, ringing quiet of a battlefield right after the final, decisive shot has been fired. Adam Schiff had just invoked the Fifth Amendment on live national television. He had just looked the American people in the eye and legally refused to answer whether he was a compromised asset of a hostile foreign power. The golden boy of the Washington establishment, the man who spent years moralizing to the rest of us about the sanctity of our democracy, was hiding behind the Constitution to stay out of a federal penitentiary. The press gallery, usually a hive of buzzing, frantic energy, was completely paralyzed. The stenographers of the corporate media didn't know what to type. Their editors in New York and Atlanta were screaming into their earpieces, demanding a spin, a pivot, a distraction. But there was no spin left. You cannot fact-check a man's own confession of absolute guilt. Senator John Kennedy did not cheer. He did not bang his fist on the mahogany desk or play to the cameras like a cheap Hollywood actor. He sat there, the absolute picture of Southern stoicism, looking at the broken, trembling shell of a man sitting across from him. Schiff was staring at the table, his shoulders slumped, his political career bleeding out on the Senate floor. Pleading the Fifth is your absolute right, Adam, Kennedy drawled, his voice low, steady, and devoid of any sympathy. But it is not a magic wand. It protects you from testifying against yourself today. But it does not protect you from the overwhelming mountain of evidence sitting right here on this desk. Kennedy reached out and placed his large, weathered hand flat on top of folder number 15. The American people have seen enough. They have heard enough. And frankly, the air in this room has gotten too toxic to breathe. Kennedy reached into the side pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, bound document, perfectly typed and legally formatted. I am not just here to expose you, Senator. I am here to ensure that the concept of equal justice under the law actually means something in this country again. I have right here a formal criminal referral drafted by myself and my remaining colleagues on this committee, who still believe in the rule of law. Kennedy put his reading glasses back on, the lenses catching the bright glare of the television lights. This referral is being submitted immediately to the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. It contains 98 distinct, documented federal charges against you, Adam. The number echoed through the chamber. 98 federal charges. Even the Democratic senators sitting on the dais, the people who had protected Schiff for a decade, physically recoiled. They were watching a political dismantling, and they were desperate to avoid the fallout. Let me just give the American people a brief summary of what you are going to be facing, Kennedy said, reading from the document. 17 counts of perjury for every time you lied to Congress under oath about the Russia hoax. 23 counts of unauthorized disclosure of classified intelligence leaked selectively to your friends in the media to manipulate financial markets and public opinion. 11 counts of obstruction of justice, including witness tampering and the deliberate suppression of exculpatory evidence. Kennedy turned the page, his voice taking on the uncompromising rhythm of a judge reading a life sentence. 7 counts of violations under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, otherwise known as RICO. Because you didn't just break the law, Adam, you ran your Senate office like a criminal enterprise. 31 counts of campaign finance violations directly tied to the compromised funds you took from bad actors like Ed Buck. Kennedy paused, letting the silence return for just a fraction of a second. And finally, Kennedy said, his voice dropping into a register that sent chills down the spine of every patriot watching at home. 9 counts of wire fraud, conspiracy, and violations of the Espionage Act, because taking money from the Chinese Communist Party in exchange for legislative sabotage is not just corruption, it is betrayal. Schiff let out a pathetic, stifled gasp, covering his mouth with his trembling hand. He looked around the room, his eyes pleading for someone, anyone, to step in and stop the fallout. But there was no one left. His $5 million lawyers had abandoned him. His media allies were writing his political obituary. His own party was already calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from his toxic fallout. Kennedy took off his glasses and set them carefully on top of the criminal referral. He began to gather his papers. He picked up the folders one by one. Folder number 1. Folder number 7. Folder number 15. He stacked them neatly with the meticulous care of a craftsman finishing a masterpiece. He placed the thick stack of damning evidence back into the battered, scarred leather briefcase. He closed the heavy leather flap. He snapped the left brass latch click. He snapped the right brass latch click. Those 2 metallic sounds were the final nails in the coffin of Adam Schiff's untouchable Washington empire. Kennedy stood up. He picked up the briefcase by its worn leather handle. He looked down at the disgraced, shattered man who had just an hour ago called him an ignorant Southern puppet. Kennedy didn't yell. He didn't gloat. He offered a smile that was so deeply traditional and so utterly lethal that it belongs in the political Hall of Fame. Bless your heart, Adam. It was the ultimate Southern finishing strike. 4 words delivered with velvet politeness, wrapping a sledgehammer of absolute destruction in the South. It can mean you are naive, it can mean you are foolish. But when delivered by a man who has just dismantled your entire life, it means you are completely, irrevocably finished. Kennedy turned his back on Adam Schiff, on the media elite, and on the Washington establishment. He walked slowly, deliberately down the center aisle of the Senate chamber. He walked out through those heavy mahogany doors, carrying his briefcase, a solitary figure who had just slain the biggest dragon in the swamp. And out there, beyond the marble walls of Capitol Hill, the country exploded. From the diners in Ohio, to the oil fields in Texas, to the mechanic shops in Florida, working-class Americans erupted in cheers. For the first time in a decade, they had watched the ruling class face actual, undeniable accountability. They had watched the arrogance of the elite shattered by the undeniable power of the truth. This is the legacy of that sunny morning in May of 2026. It will be written in the history books as the day the fever broke. It was the day the American people realized that the experts and the insiders are not invincible. They are just corrupt, and corruption is fragile when exposed to the light. The media spent years trying to convince us that the populist movement was dead. They tried to convince us that the people who lived outside the coastal bubbles were too slow, too uneducated, and too backward to challenge the administrative state. But John Kennedy proved them wrong. He proved that you should never, ever underestimate a man just because he talks slow. Because while Adam Schiff was talking fast, spinning lies and cashing foreign checks, John Kennedy was thinking fast. He was doing the work. He was gathering the facts. He was preparing the autopsy of the deep state. And when the moment came, he didn't need a teleprompter or a focus group. He just needed a beat-up leather briefcase and the absolute, uncompromising truth. The swamp took a massive, fatal blow that day, and it wasn't delivered by a highly paid consultant or a slick Washington insider. It was delivered by a simple country lawyer from Louisiana, a man who reminded us all that true power in this country does not belong to the politicians, the media, or the bureaucrats. It belongs to the truth. And the truth, my friends, always wins in the end. Stand tall, stay awake, and keep fighting.